this actually genuine crisis that the Prime Minister is facing, that, more than 100 of his MPs are currently saying they're going to vote against his important welfare reforms, these reforms to disability payments. It seems to me that just shows the sort of contradictions that drive this government. This is all this policy about trying to encourage people with disabilities, physical and mental disabilities, into work. And there are two glaring contradictions here. One is that we've got a lot of detail about the benefit cuts, but almost no detail about the mechanism for helping these people into work. And therefore, I'm not at all surprised that there's a lot of scepticism among Labour MPs that this actually ever will lead to more, sort of better lives for disabled people, because there'd be a lot of scepticism these people will actually have jobs. Against the other aspect that is so contradictory, which is this is a government that in terms of its most significant tax, and some would say economic policy, makes the cost of employment higher. Putting up employers' national insurance, we're now seeing it in the figures. It is leading not massive rises of unemployment, but there are rises in unemployment. The numbers of vacancies is diminishing. And so, you have got a government that in many ways is facing in two directions. On the one hand, they want to help disabled people to get jobs, but they're making it more expensive for employers to take anybody on. And when you've got the added risk of taking on somebody who is disabled, many employers would say, well, make your minds up. What do you want? Do you want us to hire people? Or do you want us to pay more tax?
Well, we do need to deal with welfare in detail. And my best guess, every time I think about it and step back and ponder it, is that they're just going to have to put up the pension age, and they're going to have to keep putting up, A, because it saves a lot of money, and B, because of all the other things you mentioned. I think it's going to be massively unpopular, obviously, with older people and anyone approaching retirement. That includes us. But, I just don't see an alternative.
Well, I agree.
It saves you tens of billions if you do it. And, potentially at least people who are older might accept greater spending on defence was a thing.
I agree with you that it's one of the things you'd have to do. But, you only have to look a few miles across the channel to see how putting up the pension age there has already brought down, I can't remember whether it's one or two governments, and another one looks as though it might fall, within days.
Very, very unpopular. It seems to me quite clear that the government is going to have to make significant concessions here. So why don't they just acknowledge that now? That's the thing I don't understand about this particular government, is that they, at the moment they're out there saying, no, it's going to go ahead. Keir Starmer's not going to back down. No, it's not a confidence vote, but no, we're not going to back down. And you think, well, you are going to back down. You're definitely going to back down. You're going to have to back down. So why don't you admit that now and save yourself a whole lot of pain? Or at least say, well, we're listening. We think it's important. Welfare reform is important. We're consulting. We're debating, blah, 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 blah.
The moment, and this may turn out to be naive, they think that they can make some more modest changes and pick off enough MPs such that by the time of next Tuesday's vote, it just about scrapes through. If I'm honest with you, there's not a lot of evidence that that's going to work, but that explains. That is where they are at the moment, and I suspect nearer the time they're going to work out this is a rather bigger crisis. And what the thing they want to avoid, but I just don't know whether they'll be able to, is they want to be able to avoid an absolutely blatant U-turn, because they had a blatant U-turn on, for example, winter fuel. And for another one of an even bigger magnitude so soon. I think, Starmer, understandably, he hates losing on anything. It's sort of visceral. And I just, he wants to avoid this at all costs. Whether he will succeed, I don't know. I do think they're not very good, you might argue, at either the sort of big strategic politics or the small tactics. As I understand it, those whose job it is to gauge opposition knew a couple of weeks ago that there were about 100, maybe a bit more MPs on their side who were gearing up to vote against. It is the case that they then made a modest concession, which is they introduced some sort of transitional arrangements to soften the short-term blow of the benefits being withdrawn. But most MPs said, simply paying people a bit of money for a few weeks to adjust doesn't address their fundamental concerns, and their fundamental concerns I talked about right at the beginning is what they worry about is a lot of vulnerable people are going to lose a lot of money, and they're not going to get into paid employment to either give them better lives because if you believe that working is better than not working, you might feel better about yourself, but more importantly, their incomes are not going to be increased because they won't be in work. So it is, there is a big divide between Labour opponents of these welfare cuts and the government. The obvious thing for them to do, but it was the obvious thing for them to have done right at the start, and it's even harder for them now to do this, is they should not have rushed into it. They should have announced back in, back at the time of the spring statement that there was going to be a comprehensive welfare reform in the autumn, and by then we would have had the detail of the mechanisms for getting people into work, vulnerable people into work, and we would have had the report from Charlie Mayfield about how to help employers retain disabled people, mentally and physically disabled people on their books. We'd have had all that information, and you might even, for example, have been able to couple it with some welfare reforms aimed at child poverty, like abolishing the 2-child limit when it comes to universal credit. So you could have had a big package. The reason they didn't do it then, and they can't probably do it now. In fact, this is, if you talk to them, they say, we can't do this now. And the reason for that is because if they delay it to the autumn, at the time of the budget, the OBR simply says there's a really big multi-billion pound hole here and you've got to put taxes up. And they don't want to do that. So, this is a rod that they created. It's a rod, for their own back. This is their mess, and they've got to own it. And at the moment, goodness knows how they get through it without further humiliation.